The Anarchist Cookbook, a banned book by William Powell, published in 1971, reads like a case of youthful anger masquerading as political philosophy, then accidentally leaving behind a manual for people with really bad ideas. America was seething at the time. The Vietnam War, protests, fear of the government, anger at the police, distrust of elders, the general smell of gasoline in the air. And then a book appeared that said not think, but break. Powell wrote it as an anti-government gesture, at least that's how it was presented. The young author viewed the state as a colossal machine of violence, and decided to respond with a text that combined radical instructions, weapons topics, drugs, explosives, and other accoutrements for someone who's no longer satisfied with shouting at the system. Brilliant. When there's too much fire around, there's always a smart aleck who'll bring in some dry grass and say it's a form of freedom. The book's main problem is that it didn't remain in the world of ideas. It was linked to real crimes, investigations, and violent episodes, not as an abstract symbol of rebellion on a student's shelf, but as a text that could be opened by people with resentment, a void in their minds, and a desire to turn their personal catastrophe into someone else's pain. This is where the romance of protest ends. Police reports, court cases, bans, and parents who suddenly realize that paper, too, can be a dangerous object begin. The book was restricted in various countries. In Australia, it was denied classification. Prisons and educational institutions removed it from access. In Britain, its possession by suspects could become part of criminal history because the authorities saw it not as a daring pamphlet, but as a toolbox for chaos. And yes, the ban only made it even more legendary. Humanity once again acted like a broken machine. Slap the word forbidden on something, and half the world immediately wants to know what's inside. Powell himself later disowned his own book. He said he wrote it out of anger, immaturity, and political rage, and then spent years wanting it taken out of print. A very late epiphany. First you let the monster out into the streets, then you follow it around with a sign saying, "Please do not feed." The problem is, the monster has long since found new readers. The Anarchist Cookbook isn't frightening because it's great. It's precisely not great. It's frightening because it reveals society's vile weakness. Sometimes a book, anger, and a sense of one's own exceptionalism are enough to make a person stop seeing real people before them. The authorities feared this book not because of its beautiful ideas about freedom. They feared the moment when even the most obtuse reader would decide they were no longer a confused individual, but a revolutionary with a plan. Mein Kampf is a banned book by Adolf Hitler, written after the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch, when the future dictator sat in prison and turned his political anger into writing. Not an honest diary of defeat, not an admission of mistakes, but a vast tangle of grievances, racial hatred, myths, self-pity, and plans that later ceased to be words and became a state-run mechanism of murder. The first volume was published in 1925, the second in 1926, and at first, the book wasn't a magical bestseller that immediately mesmerized the country. No, it wasn't read as widely as was later portrayed. But after the Nazis came to power, it became almost a political icon of the regime. It was given to newlyweds, distributed through government agencies, and placed on shelves as a symbol of loyalty. A paper brick meant to sit at home and quietly remind everyone, the country now has a new master, a new faith, and a new enemy. After World War II, attitudes toward the book changed entirely. Germany lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the concentration camps revealed to the world what couldn't be dismissed as rumors or enemy propaganda. And now, Hitler's text could no longer be viewed as an old political document. It became evidence. And not the sole cause of the catastrophe, of course. History is more complex than one book, but it reveals all too clearly the logic of hatred, which later took the form of laws, uniforms, trains, and ovens. After Hitler's death, the rights to the book passed to the state of Bavaria, and for decades the authorities prohibited its free reprinting in Germany. Not because the text was secret, It was known to historians, archives, and researchers. It could be found in other countries. But the state tried to prevent it from becoming a common commodity again, bought out of curiosity, without context, without commentary, with the dangerous thought, what if there's something forbiddenly wise in there? No, it's not wisdom. It's political mold, simply printed in a confident tone. When the copyright expired in 2016, a critical, scholarly edition with a wealth of commentary was published in Germany. And it was the right move. Not worship, not romanticization, but an autopsy of the idea's corpse on a historian's desk. To show where lies, where manipulation, where delirium, where calculation, where words pave the way for violence. My struggle was banned and restricted because it's more than just an old text from the past. It's an example of how a book can become a container for mass hatred. It's dangerous not because of its style, its literary power, or its depth of thought. It's dangerous because weak, angry, and humiliated people sometimes seek not truth, but permission to hate. And when they find it in print, it's not reading that begins. It's preparing for disaster. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a banned book, or rather an anti-Semitic forgery that looks like a document, but works like poison in a beautiful bottle. It was presented as a secret plan by Jewish leaders to take over the world. It sounds like the ramblings of someone who spent too much time arguing with themselves in a dark room. But it's precisely this kind of rambling that sometimes proves more terrifying than complex ideology, because it's simple, vicious, and sticks to the brain faster than normal thought. The text appeared in the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 20th century and quickly became a handy tool for those who needed an enemy. It's not a real analysis of economics, politics, or social problems. No, too difficult. It's much simpler to say, a secret group is to blame for everything. They control everything. They're everywhere. They're around every corner. Primitive? Yes. Does it work? Unfortunately, for people hungry for hatred, it works just fine. The main abomination of the Protocols is that it's not just a lie, it's a full-blown lie. The text was cobbled together from other sources, reworked, adjusted, and pasted together like a cheap mask for old hatred. In 1921, the British newspaper The Times revealed that significant portions of the text repeated a political satire by Maurice Joly, written back in the 19th century and having no connection whatsoever to Jews. In other words, what we have here isn't even original nonsense, it's stolen nonsense, disguised as a conspiracy. But the revelation didn't kill the book. This is where the real horror begins. A normal person thinks, if a forgery is proven, the story is over. How naive. For a fanatic, proof means nothing. They don't seek the truth. They seek permission to hate. So the Protocols continued to be printed, distributed, quoted, and used in propaganda. They were picked up by Black Hundred circles, then the Nazis, then various extremists around the world. The forgery lived on, like an infection that doesn't care about a medical textbook. Henry Ford in the United States spread anti-Semitic material through his newspaper, and the Protocols became part of this wave of filth. Nazi propaganda also used text as fuel. Then came the real consequences: discrimination, pogroms, violence, a state-run machine of hatred. Paper doesn't pull the trigger on its own, but it can teach a person for years who to target. This is precisely why the Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been banned, restricted, and deemed extremist in various countries. Not because it conceals a dangerous truth. It contains a dangerous lie. And a lie that has been disguised for centuries as a document, and directed hatred against an entire people is not a harmless old book. It is not an artifact for the curious. It is a wasteful mechanism that turns fear into accusations, accusations into persecution, and persecution into bloodshed. The Protocols aren't scary because of their intelligence. There's little intelligence there. They're scary because they reveal the most vulnerable button in the human psyche. Give the crowd a simple enemy, print it in a serious tone, add a semblance of secrecy, and some people will happily turn off their brains. That's why such texts are banned not as ideas, but as poison. Because sometimes a book doesn't enlighten a person. Sometimes it teaches them to be worse. Tyndale's English New Testament is a banned book by William Tyndale, and it sounds almost absurd. The man was persecuted not for inciting sedition, not for secret instructions, and not for a political conspiracy, but for translating the Bible into English. Yes, so that the common man could read the sacred text for himself, without the filter of an ecclesiastical church, without the Latin wall, and without intermediaries who guarded the meaning like a locked safe. In the early 16th century, the Bible in Western Europe was like a locked room for most people. The text was in Latin, the liturgy was in Latin, scholars and clergy argued in Latin, and the common man stood by and was expected to believe those who explained it. A very convenient system. God was supposedly for everyone, but access to the instructions was restricted to a select group of specialists. The rest of us just listened, nodded, and didn't ask any unnecessary questions. Tyndale wanted to break this pattern. He translated the New Testament from Greek into English and printed it outside of England, because at home he was quickly made to understand that such independence was of no use to anyone. In 1526, his translation began to be smuggled into England. Books were hidden in goods, transported across seas, passed from hand to hand. The Bible became contraband. Brilliant. The sacred text was transported as if it were forbidden goods, because the authorities were afraid that people would suddenly begin to understand the words without permission from their superiors. Bishop Cuthbert Tunstall of London publicly condemned the translation. Copies were bought and burned outside St. Paul's Cathedral. Fire, crowds, power, books. An old human trope. If a thought interferes with control, it must be cast into the flames, and the problem pretended to be solved. Only the problem wasn't solved. The money from the purchased copies, ironically, helped finance new editions. The censors literally paid for the continuation of what they wanted to destroy. Stupidity sometimes acts as a sponsor of its own defeat. Tyndale hid in Europe, continuing his work, translating, writing, and arguing. Then he was betrayed, arrested near Antwerp, held in the fortress of Vilvoorde, and executed in 1536. First they strangled him, then burned his body, for his translation, for his words, for making the text understandable to people who had been kept at a distance from their own faith for centuries. The most poisonous part of this story is that the English Bible ultimately prevailed. Tyndale's translations greatly influenced subsequent English editions, including the famous King James Version. The very thing for which he was killed later became the foundation of religious culture. First the stake, then the cannon. Humanity loves such vile turns, executing a man for an idea and then quietly enjoying its fruits. Tyndale's English New Testament was banned because it took away the authorities' monopoly on meaning. When people read the text themselves, it's harder to manipulate them through retelling. That's what they feared. Not the ink, not the paper, but the moment when the average reader opens the book and realizes the intermediary no longer has their hand in their throat. Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems is a banned book by Galileo Galilei, whose full title is Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Published in 1632, it looked almost peaceful on paper. Scientists conversing, arguing, comparing the old picture of the cosmos with the new. Beautiful, intelligent, no torches or shouting. However, the church authorities quickly realized that what they were reading was not a calm conversation, but a carefully sharpened knife hidden under the cover. Galileo took two models of the world. In one, the earth stands at the center, and everything else respectfully circles around it, like courtiers around an ancient throne. In the other, the earth itself moves around the sun, and man suddenly ceases to be the motionless center of the universe. To a modern reader, this sounds normal. For the 17th century, it was practically a slap in the face of the established order. Because it wasn't just about astronomy. It was about the power to explain reality. Galileo had already managed to irritate the right people. He looked through a telescope and saw things that didn't fit neatly into the church's comfortable schema. Mountains on the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus. The sky suddenly turned out to be not a perfect crystal decoration, but a normal, physical world with irregularities, movement, and facts. And facts, as we all know, are terribly rude. They don't ask permission from officials in robes.
Formally, the dialogue was written as a debate between three characters. One defended the old system, another the new, and the third seemed to maintain balance. But the reader quickly understood where the author was heading. Galileo's advocate of geocentrism seemed less than intelligent, and this became a separate problem. Pope Urban VIII decided that this character had ridiculed his own arguments. Here, science had collided not with theology, but with personal pride, a very dangerous area. Ideas can still be discussed. Insulted authorities usually immediately seek punishment. In 1633, Galileo was summoned to Rome. The Inquisition found him suspected of heresy, forced him to renounce his support for the Earth's motion, and placed him under house arrest. His book was banned. It was added to the Index of Forbidden Books, where it remained for decades. The old man who peered at the sky through a device proved more dangerous than many political ranters, because he brought not a slogan, but an observation. Galileo's dialogue wasn't banned because it was vulgar, obscene, or a call to rebellion. It was worse. It demonstrated that reality can be verified without the permission of authority. And if one man with a telescope is right, and a vast system is wrong, the entire system begins to look less like a sacred fortress and more like an old, cracked building. This is what people fear about books, not their pages, but the moment when the reader looks up to the sky and realizes even the authorities can be wrong about the universe. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres is a banned book by Nicholas Copernicus, published in 1543, almost as the author himself was on the brink of death.
And this is where it gets especially funny, if you forget that the story is actually quite serious. A man spent decades calculating, checking, rewriting, and being cautious. And then his book quietly came out and began slowly dismantling the old universe, piece by piece. Copernicus didn't run through public squares shouting that he would save everyone from stupidity. He was a canon, a mathematician, an astronomer, a man painfully cautious. His idea sounded devastatingly simple for the old order. The Earth isn't at the center of the universe, but revolves around the sun. Yes, today, even a school child staring at a smartphone knows this, oblivious to the scale of the catastrophe. But back then, such an idea wasn't just a blow to astronomy. It was a blow to human pride, to the familiar worldview, and to a system where truth often descended from above, like a command. The book was published in Nuremberg.
The preface, written anonymously by Andreas Osiander, attempted to present the theory as a convenient mathematical model rather than a description of reality. A very clever move. Almost an intellectual insurance policy, as if to say, don't worry, gentlemen, no one is actually moving the Earth. We're just counting celestial circles here for convenience. The only problem is that ideas are sometimes more brazen than their editors. They can be wrapped in cautious words, but if there's an explosion inside, the paper still starts smoking. At first, the book didn't immediately spark a fire. It was complex, expensive, written for educated people. Not a mass-market leaflet, not a street pamphlet. A genuine technical strike to the brain, where ordinary panic takes a while to reach. But the further the controversy over the Earth's movement developed, the more the church authorities realized this thing was dangerous. Not because readers would revolt tomorrow, but because they would start asking why reality had to match the official explanation. In 1616, the Catholic Church placed Copernicus's book on the Index of Forbidden Books until the text could be corrected. Some passages required softening so that heliocentrism would be presented not as a statement, but as a hypothesis. How beautiful! So the universe can rotate in any direction, but the book must be carefully worded so as not to damage the administrative picture of the cosmos. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres wasn't banned for its crudeness, obscenity, or political appeal. It wasn't a cheap scandal. It was worse for the old regime,
a calm, calculated attempt to explain the heavens without the usual throne at the center. Copernicus didn't insult the world. He simply displaced the Earth from its central place. And for a man accustomed to considering himself the center of everything, this was almost a personal humiliation. That's the whole tragicomedy.
Sometimes, the most dangerous book doesn't scream. It simply opens the page and tells you, you weren't where you thought you were. The Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert is a banned book, though the word book seems too modest here. It was a massive, multi-volume project of the Enlightenment, published in France in 1751, and looked to the authorities like a gunpowder cache disguised as a reference book. On the cover, it seemed, lay knowledge, science, crafts, arts, technology, philosophy. But inside, the slow destruction of the old order through the alphabet. Denis Diderot and Jean Laurent d'Alembert gathered scientists, philosophers, engineers, doctors, craftsmen, and thinkers around a project. They wanted to describe human knowledge in such a way that it would cease to be a toy for a narrow circle of the rich, churchmen, and courtly wiseacres. And here, the old system began to itch. As long as people know nothing, they are easy to control. As long as crafts are passed down in whispers, power rests. As long as only authorized people ask questions, the world stands on its familiar supports. But when knowledge is printed in thousands of pages and explained in simple language, control begins to crack. What particularly irritated the church and the royal power wasn't the encyclopedia's coverage of machine tools, fabrics, medicine, or mechanics. They were infuriated by the idea that reason had the right to test authority, not to bow to it, not to kiss its ring, but to test it. The articles concealed attacks on superstition, religious oppression, censorship, and class privilege. Not always head-on, often sly, dry, almost polite. The most dangerous type of attack. This kind doesn't shout. It simply makes the reader think. In 1752, the first volumes were already banned.
The project was later permitted again, because even the censors understood that completely stifling such a knowledge machine would be inappropriate, as there were too many influential people around. But in 1759, the royal privilege was revoked, and the Catholic Church added the encyclopedia to its list of banned books. It's a magnificent picture. The authorities look at a reference book and see not just a piece of paper, but a threat to the regime. Diderot didn't stop. He continued his work almost clandestinely, risking searches, arrests, and the complete destruction of the project. Printers, editors, patrons, secret agreements. An entire knowledge production network under the state's nose. And all so that people could read about how the world works without official brainwashing. The Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert was banned because it made knowledge public. And public knowledge is more dangerous to any old regime than crude abuse. Abuse can be punished.
Rebellion can be dispersed. But a person who has learned to compare, doubt, and understand the workings of things is no longer so easily brought to their knees by a beautiful seal and a stern voice from above. The Prince is a banned book by Niccolò Machiavelli, written in 1513, when the author himself had already been expelled from high-level politics, having survived arrest, torture, and exile after the Medicis returned to Florence. A perfect time for a quiet retirement? No. Machiavelli sat down and wrote one of the coldest texts on power, as if he had dissected the ruler on a table and begun to reveal. Here is fear. Here is calculation. Here is deception. Here is blood beneath the beautiful fabric. The book appears small, almost modest, but within it lies an unpleasant power. Machiavelli doesn't explain how a ruler should appear in a temple, in a portrait, or in a ceremonial speech. He talks about how a ruler actually maintains power in a world where allies are sold, cities are betrayed, armies flee, and morality often works only until the first serious crisis. And this is what infuriated me most. He didn't invent dirty politics. He simply stopped pretending it was clean. Italy at that time was not a peaceful, unified country. There were republics, principalities, papal dominions, foreign armies, intrigues, mercenaries, deals, and backstabbing as an almost normal method of elite communication. Machiavelli saw this without reading a textbook.
He worked in Florentine diplomacy, met with rulers, witnessed wars, and understood perfectly well. Describing power in the language of a church postcard would amount to a beautiful lie for people who would soon be devoured. The most scandalous aspect of The Prince is that Machiavelli separated politics from conventional morality.
He wrote that a ruler must be able to be harsh, cunning, and ungrateful if the state's survival demands it. Not because evil is beautiful, but because real power often chooses not between good and evil, but between something bad and something even worse. A very unpleasant thought for those who like to garnish violence with words of nobility. After Machiavelli's death, the book was published in 1532, and in 1559, all his works were placed on the Catholic Index of Forbidden Books. The Church saw him as a dangerous author who stripped power of its sacred veneer and revealed that rulers acted not only through prayer, virtue, and concern for the people. Oh, come on. Sometimes they pressure, intimidate, buy, deceive, and then call it the interests of the state. The Prince wasn't banned because Machiavelli taught people to be scoundrels. Scoundrels got by just fine without him. The book was feared because it gave vileness a precise vocabulary. It said out loud what palaces, churches, and thrones preferred to keep behind closed doors. Power often wants to appear holy, but works like a meat-making machine. And when someone describes this machine too honestly, the censor immediately reaches for the lock. Because banning a mirror is easier than recognizing one's own face in the reflection. The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine, a banned book published in the late 18th century, struck the British monarchy not with a fist, but with the phrase, "Power does not belong to kings by birthright." Those on the throne, of course, didn't appreciate this. Their entire system rested on the beautiful fairy tale that some people are born to rule, while others are born to pay, listen, and bow. Paine took this fairy tale and began to dismantle it as a cheap smokescreen. The book was a response to Edmund Burke, who attacked the French Revolution and defended the old order. Paine didn't mince words. He bluntly declared that hereditary monarchy was a political relic, and that human rights existed not because they were graciously bestowed upon them by a ruler. They belonged to the people from the very beginning. A very dangerous idea. Because if a person believes that rights were handed down to them from above, they will ask for them. And if they understand that they are their own, they begin to demand them. The first part was published in 1791, the second in 1792, and there Paine went beyond mere criticism of kings. He spoke of representative government, social support for the poor, assistance to the elderly, taxes on wealth, and a more just government. For the British elite, this sounded less like philosophy than like an alarm bell ringing in a household where masters had long been accustomed to servants remaining silent. The book quickly became a mass-market product. It was bought, reprinted, discussed in clubs, workshops, shops, and on the streets. This was what the authorities feared most. Not just one book on an aristocrat's shelf, but a cheap edition in the hands of a craftsman, a worker, a merchant, a person who yesterday considered politics someone else's game, and today reads it and thinks, wait, why am I even being ruled by a family that was just lucky enough to be born closer to the throne? The British government charged Paine with seditious libel. He was persecuted. He fled to France, and in England he was tried in absentia and found guilty. Distributors and publishers were pressured. Radical societies were dispersed, and copies of the book became almost a political contagion. A classic. When an argument hits too hard, the authorities label it a crime. Rights of Man was banned because the book called monarchy not a sacred order, but a human construct that could be abolished. And that's more frightening than any rudeness. A bad word can be forgiven. But the idea that power isn't eternal can never be locked back into the skull. Paine wrote a text that made the crown look less like a heavenly symbol and more like an expensive object on the head of an ordinary person. And for the old world, that was practically an insult to physics.
The Communist Manifesto was a banned book by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, published in 1848, just before Europe began to crumble under the weight of revolutions, barricades, and the panic of the old regimes. The text was short, angry, and dense, not a multi-volume philosophical tower for university classrooms, but a political hammer with which the authors smashed the window of capitalist society. The book was commissioned by the Communist League, a small revolutionary organization that needed a program, not a beautiful anthem.
Marx and Engels provided precisely that program. History as a class struggle, the bourgeoisie as the new master of the world, the proletariat as the force that must overthrow the old system. To monarchs, factory owners, and police chiefs, this didn't sound like theory. It sounded like instructions for a fire in the building where they sat on the upper floors. The manifesto's greatest danger lay in its simplicity. It didn't whisper. It didn't hide behind soft formulas. It told the working man, your poverty isn't accidental. Your fatigue isn't a personal failure. Your boss isn't a noble provider, but part of a machine that squeezes your strength out and sells it for a higher price. Imagine how gratifying it was for factory owners to hear that. Almost like discovering that their machines had started reading political literature. In the 19th century, this text was banned, confiscated, and persecuted through censorship and the police. In the Russian Empire, Marxist literature was printed abroad, smuggled in, copied, and passed between circles. The authorities understood perfectly well that a single copy alone won't topple a throne, but it can infect others with questions. And the question, why do some own everything while others sell their lives by the hour, is more dangerous than any loud slogan for any rigid system. At the same time, the Communist Manifesto cannot honestly be described as a harmless book about equality. No, it is a text with a radical charge, calling for a struggle against the existing order and the abolition of bourgeois ownership of the means of production. In the 20th century, the ideas of Marx and Engels became part of enormous political projects, revolutions, party dictatorships, repressions, and civil conflicts. Paper alone does not make history, but sometimes paper gives people the language they later use to justify both liberation and violence.
The Communist Manifesto was banned because it struck a nerve with power. Who owns the world, and why should anyone else consider that normal? The old regimes weren't afraid of pages. They feared the moment when a worker, student, or soldier reads a text and suddenly stops thinking that their place at the bottom was created by nature. That's when a book ceases to be a book. It becomes a match in a room that has long smelled of smoke. The Gulag Archipelago, a banned book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, was more than just an unpleasant text for the Soviet regime. It was the uncovering of a vast abscess hidden for decades beneath rhetoric about a bright future. The state showcased factories, parades, slogans, happy faces, and polite speeches. But Solzhenitsyn brought out the camps, arrests, denunciations, transports, investigations, fear, and all the carnage the system called necessary. The book wasn't based on fantasy or rumors from a dark corner. Solzhenitsyn himself lived through the camp and then collected testimonies from former prisoners, documents, memoirs, letters, and personal stories. He showed not one isolated incident, but an entire web of violence, stretching across the country like a chain of islands. Hence the title, An Archipelago. Not one prison, not one evil warden, but a vast system where a person could disappear from ordinary life with a knock on the door, a signature on a report, or a whispered remark. Work on the book was carried out secretly. The text was hidden, retyped, passed around in pieces, and kept by trusted people. In the Soviet Union, such a manuscript couldn't simply be submitted to a publisher and expect a polite response. At best, it would be destroyed. At worst, they would destroy more than just the paper. After the authorities got their hands on one of the copies, Solzhenitsyn decided to publish the book abroad. In 1973, the first volume was published in Paris. For the Soviet regime, this was a punch in the face, only without the fist, with paper. The reaction was predictable to the point of nausea. The writer was declared a slanderer, an enemy, a traitor, a man who supposedly denigrated the homeland. A brilliant ploy. If someone shows a basement where people were beaten for years, they should be accused not of being right, but of treating the building poorly. In 1974, Solzhenitsyn was arrested, stripped of his citizenship, and exiled.
The state couldn't calmly argue with the book. It simply threw the author abroad, as if memory could be thrown out along with him. In the USSR, the Gulag Archipelago remained banned for many years. It was read in samizdat, secretly, at risk, sometimes at night, sometimes on typewritten copies, where every page was considered evidence. Official publication within the country only became possible in the late 1980s, when the system itself was already cracking and beginning to acknowledge what it had previously declared to be lies. The Gulag Archipelago was banned because it attacked not a single official, but a myth, the most beautiful mask of the state. It said, behind the slogans were cells, behind the plans were prison camps, behind the grandiose words were people ground up by the machine. And this is what the authorities fear most. Not hatred, not outcry, but detailed testimony that calmly reveals exactly where the system's teeth lay. The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, a banned book published in 1949, struck the conservative world like a rude knock on the door of a room where, for centuries, women had been quietly relegated to the shelves. Wife, mother, adornment, helpmate, patient shadow at a man's side. De Beauvoir entered without apology and said, "Stop pretending this cage is called nature." The book was enormous, dense, and wicked in its clarity. De Beauvoir examined biology, history, religion, myths, literature, parenting, marriage, motherhood, work, old age, and sexuality. She showed how society, for centuries, had molded women into others, not independent centers of life, but appendages to a male world. Men, as it were, the main text. Women, as it were, a footnote in the fine print. A very convenient construct for those who sit above and call it the natural order. The book was particularly hard on the familiar phrase, "It's always been this way," a brilliant phrase for lazy minds. It can justify almost any injustice if uttered with sufficient confidence. De Beauvoir didn't buy it. She showed that many women's fates were shaped by upbringing, economic dependence, religious pressure, and laws written by people who delighted in being the measure of everything. In 1956, the Vatican added The Second Sex to its index of forbidden books. The Church saw it as a threat to morality, family, and the established worldview. Of course. When a woman begins to talk about herself as a person, rather than as a function of someone else's home, the old institutions immediately take a turn for the worse. For centuries, they've been telling her where to stand, what to want, how to remain silent, and what to be proud of. And then a book comes along and calmly dismantles the whole mechanism, down to the last screw. The scandal was further heightened by the fact that de Beauvoir spoke about the body, desire, marriage, and motherhood without sugarcoating. She didn't turn women's lives into a postcard with soft light. She showed fatigue, dependence, fear, coercion, boredom, humiliation, and sometimes even women's voluntary participation in their own imprisonment. Unpleasant? Yes. But more honest than the eternal stage set design about happiness, which for some reason is required to be proven by silence. The Second Sex was banned because it took away society's favorite excuse. Women are like this. Nature is like this. Order is like this. The book said, no, order was created by people, which means people can dismantle it. For the authorities, this is always bad news. After all, the most dangerous reader isn't the one who gets angry. The most dangerous is the one who suddenly realizes that their cage was assembled by someone else's hands. The Kama Sutra is a forbidden book that many still portray as an ancient catalog of sexual gymnastics, though in reality it's a Sanskrit treatise on love, marriage, pleasure, urban life, relationships, and social behavior. Yes, there's physicality there. Of course there is. But turning the entire text into one big, obscene image is like looking at an entire library through a keyhole and then confidently claiming to have understood civilization. The text is associated with Vatsyayana and is usually dated to the 1st centuries CE. It originated in India, where discussions of desire could be part of a philosophical conversation about human life. Not a coy whisper under the covers, not a cheap scandal for those with overheated imaginations, but an attempt to systematize relationships, norms of behavior, courtship,
marriage, pleasure, and the place of desire alongside other human goals. It sounds too calm for a book that Victorian morality later greeted as if a wild animal had been brought into its living room. In Europe, the Kama Sutra became particularly scandalous after its English translation, associated with Richard Burton and Forster Arbuthnot. In 1883, the text was published through a private company, circumventing British obscenity laws. It's a graceful scene. An empire collects artifacts, languages, texts, and territories. But as soon as an honest discussion of the body appears in an ancient treatise, a moral fever erupts among decent people. The main fear wasn't just the frankness.
The European public was irritated by the fact that the book discussed desire without the usual punitive tone, without the obligatory shame, without the idea that the body is a dirty mechanism to be endured for the sake of procreation and then quickly hidden under thick fabric. The Kama Sutra looked at people differently. Desire exists, it can be described, studied, discussed. For a society accustomed to blushing at its own thoughts, this sounded almost like an attack. Obscenity laws prevented the text from being freely published in Britain and the United States for a long time. It was privately printed, distributed sparingly, and cloaked in academic garb, as if the adult world needed official permission to acknowledge the obvious. Humans aren't made up solely of prayer, work, and good posture. What a terrifying discovery. The censor, poor thing, probably hoped that if he closed the book, human desire would cease to exist. A very mature approach. Kind of like banning rain because it's wet. The Kama Sutra was banned because it shattered the convenient lie of an innocent society. It reminded us that body culture doesn't begin with dirt, and that discussing desire needn't be a crime. The authorities and moral overseers weren't afraid of the ancient Indian text itself. They were afraid of the reader, who would suddenly realize that shame is often sold as a virtue, and silence is passed off as purity. This is where the book becomes dangerous. It doesn't corrupt. It removes the artificial, forbidden smoke from the subject. The King Never Smiles is Paul Hanley's banned book about the Thai king Bhumibol Adulyadej, and it was banned in Thailand before the average reader could even calmly open the first page. That's the level of anxiety. The book hadn't even reached the masses, hadn't even hit the shelves, hadn't even reached the masses, and yet the government had already pushed the red button. Why?
Because this wasn't just a politician, not a minister with a bad memory, but a monarch who had been surrounded by an almost sacred aura for decades. The book was published in 2006 by Yale University Press. Handley was a journalist working in Thailand, writing not a tourist postcard of golden temples, but a political biography. He portrayed Bhumibol not as a silent, benevolent symbol standing above the fray, but as a figure closely connected to the army, the elite, the palace networks, and the real struggle for power. For the Thai official narrative, this was like cutting a knife through glass. The king should be above politics. But here the author says, wait, this image is also man-made. Thailand has a strict law protecting the monarchy. Insulting, slandering, or threatening the king, queen, heir apparent, or regent can result in a prison sentence of up to 15 years per conviction. And this isn't just a decorative statute, it's actually been enforced. Therefore, a book about the king under this system turns not into a standard biography, but into a minefield where every sentence can cost a person their freedom. The authorities banned the import and distribution of the book. Websites related to it were blocked. Discussing it openly within the country was dangerous. The beautiful logic of the closed cult of power. If the ruler's image is so strong, why is he afraid of paper? If the people's love is so natural, why protect it with a criminal code? Apparently, because forced respect always knows the truth about itself. It is fragile. It must be guarded, like a precious vase in a room full of angry people. The King Never Smiles wasn't banned because of its sordid scenes, its fantasies, or its cheap scandal. People feared it because it removed the museum glass from the monarchy. It exposed a person, an institution, politics, connections, interests. And any power that lives at a sacred distance hates being brought closer.
While the king is distant, he's a symbol.
Bring the book closer and the symbol begins to cast an all-too-human shadow. Spycatcher is a banned book by Peter Wright, a former MI5 officer in the British Counterintelligence Agency. It's a case of the state fearing not an enemy from without, but its own former agent with a manuscript. Wright didn't write a novel about spies and expensive suits. He wrote a memoir about the inner workings of the Secret Service, where, instead of a beautiful legend about defenders of the country, surveillance, intrigue, paranoia, and accusations suddenly emerged, leaving the British government speechless. The book was published in 1987, but before then, the authorities tried to suppress it. Wright was living in Australia and wanted to publish his memoirs about his time at MI5. The British government said it was impossible. State secrets, official obligations, security, it was all serious business. Sounded decent.
Only it looked like the old imperial machine chasing after an elderly former intelligence officer, screaming, "Put our skeletons back in the closet immediately." In Spycatcher, Wright wrote about attempts to find a Soviet mole within the British intelligence services, about wiretaps, internal suspicions, and the grimy, tense atmosphere of the Cold War. His allegations of a conspiracy by some of his staff against Prime Minister Harold Wilson were particularly notorious. Proving all this as absolute truth was difficult, and some of his assertions were disputed and denied. But for the authorities, the problem wasn't just the accuracy of every detail. The problem was the fact itself. A former insider was revealing that within that system, the stench of not only patriotism, but also fear, arbitrary rule, mutual predation, and political filth lingered. The British tried to ban its publication through the Australian courts. They lost. The book was published and became an international bestseller. And then the smoke and mirrors began. For a long time, it was impossible to publish it properly in the UK or discuss it in the press, even though thousands of copies were already being sold abroad. This meant that a citizen could fly in from another country with a copy in their suitcase, and local newspapers were still forced to pretend the secret was locked away. A beautiful piece of bureaucratic magic. The book exists in the world, but the state asks its own country to feign blindness. The ban only heightened interest. Of course it did. When the government bans an intelligence officer's memoirs, it's writing on the cover. This contains something unpleasant for the higher-ups. People don't calm down when they hear the word secret. They become even more eager to know what exactly is being hidden from them. Spycatcher was banned because the book shattered the comfortable image of the intelligence services as a flawless shadow silently protecting society. Wright revealed a different shadow, nervous, suspicious, politically dangerous, overly confident in its right to operate without the light. And the authorities weren't just afraid of leaks. They were afraid of something even more vile. That citizens would suddenly see how the defenders of the law sometimes live as if the law were just furniture in their office.